So let's begin today with the Parsha. The Parsha this week is Pinchas. Pinchas begins in a continuation of the story that we had at the end of the day, at the end of last week, where there was the Moabite and Midianites were afraid of Israel, and they came up with a scheme to try to get Hashem angry at them by having Moabite and Midianite women attempt to seduce the Israelite men and get them to worship idols. And that led to an outbreak of a plague. And then a Jewish leader from the tribe of Shimon by the name of Zimri came before Moses together with a Midianite princess and challenged Moses if it is permitted to be with this woman, and then went ahead and publicly cohabited with her. And at that moment, Pinchas, who was Aaron's grandson, took a spear and killed them both in public. And at that moment, the plague subsided, and the parsha opens with Hashem telling Moshe that Pinchas has calmed Hashem's anger, so to speak, against the children of Israel with his zealous act, and therefore Hashem is giving his everlasting covenant of peace, and will make him a Kohen. Although Pinchas was a grandson of Aaron, since he was born prior to the Exodus, only future grandchildren of Aaron became Kohanim, but those born prior to Exodus, of which we only know of Pinchas, were not included as Kohanim. And however, now Hashem is going to make Pinchas and his future descendants all Kohanim because of what he had done. Perhaps one day we could actually talk about topics. We can discuss violence in the name of God and the like, and whether there's ever such a place for violence. But to continue, Hashem then tells Moshe, to just continue the parsha, Hashem tells Moshe to count the people. They count the people, again, each tribe, tribe by tribe, in addition to counting the people as they had done earlier in the book of, at the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, in the beginning of the book of Numbers. They also mention not only the tribes, but each family. So each tribe subdivides into families, and they mention each family as well. The total number is 601,730, a little bit less than they had been 40 years ago, when they had been 603,550. Then Hashem tells Moshe that he's going to split the land of Israel to all these people using a lottery. They also then count the Levite family. And then at this point, there is 5 daughters of a fellow called Salafchat, whose father had died in the desert, but he had no sons. And they were under the impression that only sons can inherit their father's land. And therefore, they were afraid that his land that he was going to get in the land of Israel was going to go to his brothers rather than his children, and that way his name will be forgotten. When they came before Moshe and asked if they could get their father's portion, and then Moshe then told them yes, they spoke to Hashem, and Hashem said yes, they can get their father's portion, and told them that when there are no sons, then the daughters inherit as well. And then the Torah goes through briefly the laws of inheritance. Last year we did a class about the Jewish laws of inheritance, how it works, what the biblical law was, what the workaround that is widely done today, how Jewish inheritance law works, and how it's employed nowadays. So we did a class about that. I encourage you, if you're curious, to listen to the podcast. At this point, Hashem tells Moshe, you are going to die. Go up to Mount Nebo, which was a mountain overlooking where they were, just east of the Jordan. You're going to die, and because of the incident in last week's parsha where Moshe had hit the rock. And so Moshe turns to Hashem and asks Hashem to appoint a leader, a successor that can lead the people just as he had. And Hashem says, yes, I will appoint, you should appoint Yehoshua, Joshua, your student, as your successor, and he, along with Elazar, the high priest, will lead the people. And so Moshe does that. And the rest of the parsha goes through the laws of sacrifices, particularly the sacrifices of the festivals. So we start with the daily sacrifice. The Torah goes through the laws of daily sacrifice that should be brought twice each day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. Then it continues to the special Shabbat Musaf, the Musaf additional sacrifice that was brought on Shabbat. Then it continues to go through the sacrifice of Rosh Chodesh, of the new month. And then we go through the sacrifices of each festival, starting with Passover, then Shavuot, then Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and finally Shmini Atzeret. So it goes through all the different sacrifices. So that is the Parsha in short. I want to also mention that this coming Thursday is going to be the fast of the 17th of Tammuz. It is one of 4 fast days that we observe over the year to commemorate the destruction of the temple. The 17th of Tammuz marks the day when the Romans besieged Jerusalem. The Romans breached the walls of Jerusalem after a long siege. And then 3 weeks later, on the 9th of Av, was when they actually destroyed the temple. And so these 3 weeks, so it's a morning to night fast. It starts in the morning at when the earliest light is visible, 72 minutes before sunrise, which is, I think, about 4 a.m. or so nowadays. And it ends also fairly late because it's a long summer day at, I think, close to after 8, but it ends fairly late, closer to 9, I think. This day also begins a 3-week mourning period that ends on Tisha B'Av, which will be in 3 weeks, which marks the destruction of the temple. This mourning period starts, we avoid certain things as a sign of mourning. It starts, there's a few different steps, and it gets stricter and stricter until Tisha B'Av. But the first step, starting this Thursday, we don't have weddings, we don't have celebrations. During this period, we also don't cut our hair, we don't buy new clothing, we don't buy new homes. During this 3-week period, you can cut your hair before Thursday. We don't and we don't do these things during this period, again, from the 17th of Tammuz, which is going to be this Thursday, for the following 3 weeks. Then, following that, on from the 1st of Av, which is going to be in 2 weeks, then we add certain additional stringencies, and then going till the 9th of Av. But we will talk about those, God willing, next week. Any questions? Yes, Deb.
On these fasts, do you drink water?
No. No food or water.
Okay. So I would always be fasting. I had a dance teacher who fell because she got dehydrated from a fast.
So you should be very careful not to get, that's a very good point. You have to be very careful not to get dehydrated from a fast. The key is firstly to drink well the day before, so you are well hydrated going into it, and also not to put yourself in very hot places, not to overexert yourself. But if you don't overexert yourself and you don't stand out in the sun for hours, if you don't stand in the sun for hours and you don't exert yourself, virtually all healthy people can fast just fine without food or water, and nothing will happen.
Without that, people live without water and food for many days. Look what's happening in Venezuela.
Yeah, I don't know how long you can go without water, but you definitely could go a day and you'll be just fine. At most, you'll get a bit of a headache. I think more people struggle from fasting without coffee than without water.
Coffee is one of the most addictive things there is.
So last week I mentioned that yesterday was the 12th of Tammuz. Today is the 13th of Tammuz. Yesterday was the birthday of the previous Rebbe, who was born in 1880. And it is also the anniversary of the 99th anniversary of the date that the previous Rebbe was released from Soviet prison. Now, in the past, we did a class where we spoke about the previous Rebbe's arrest and release, the the causes for it, and why he was arrested, why he was released, and we got into the details. We got into all the details. We've also done classes where we spoke about Jewish life underground and keeping Judaism alive in the Soviet Union and the battle for Judaism. So we've had classes dedicated to that. We've also spoke about escaping Jews that escaped from the Soviet Union. But today I want to talk about the previous Rebbe, that is the Rebbe's father-in-law. His name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And I want to focus on his life, on his life story, since after all, yesterday was his birthday. Today we'll tell the story of Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the sixth Chabad Rebbe and the father-in-law of the Rebbe. He is one of the most fascinating and definitely one of the most influential Jewish leaders in his time, which primarily we're talking about the first half of the 20th century. He is born in 1880. As we'll see, he really began his career at 15 years old in 1895. And he was active as a Jewish leader until his death in 1950. So he really spanned the first 50 years of the 20th century. He had a fascinating life. He's born during the later decades of the Russian Empire, which at the time had by far the largest Jewish community in the world. He becomes a very important leader over there in the Russian Empire. He lived through World War I, where he's a very important Jewish leader. The communism coming and the Russian Empire becoming the Soviet Union, World War II, and eventually moved to the United States, which that trajectory of Jews that were born in the Russian Empire and lived through World War I and World War II and made it to the United States is fairly common. There were many, many, many people like that, but he was really one of the Jewish leaders that really was involved, that lived through all this and led the Jewish community through all of this. And so he's really one of the leading and most fascinating Jewish leaders of the first half of the 20th century, and he plays a crucial part in Jewish life through all of these major events. And he left as we'll talk about soon, he left a very, very important legacy. We could say he single-handedly saved Jewish life in the Soviet Union and was one of the primary people responsible for creating Jewish life here in the United States. So let's go back to the beginning. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak was born in the small town of Lubavitch, which at the time served as the center of the Chabad movement, which is in Russia today. It's just next to the border on the very very western part of Russia, just next to the border with Belarus. At the time of his birth in 1880, his grandfather was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a renowned Jewish Hasidic leader. Soon after his birth, 2 years later in 1882, his grandfather died, and some years later his father took over and became the leader of the Chabad Hasidic movement. So Rav Yosef Yitzchak grows up in the town of Lubavitch as the only son of his father, the only child. He's an only child, and he's, of course, the expected successor of his father. So he grows up knowing this kind of that he's going to be groomed from a young child. He's groomed to become a leader. His father is not only a major Hasidic leader with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of followers across the Russian Empire. He is also a major leader of Jewry in the Russian Empire at the time. The Russian Empire at this point numbered some 5 million Jews. It was by far the largest community in the world. Jews at the time were also going through immense persecution. I hope to do a class soon where we'll talk about Jews in the Russian Empire. It was one of our worst. Didn't last that long from a historical perspective, little over 100 years, but it was one of the worst places Jews have ever lived. As the Russian Empire as time went on, it got worse and worse. And so he was very involved in Jewish life in the Russian Empire and trying to help Jews within the Russian Empire. And so the father of the Rebbe, whose name was Reb Shalom Dov Ber, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, together with other leading rabbis in Russia, lobbied the anti-Semitic Russian government on behalf of the Jewish people, trying to limit the anti-Semitic rules. and laws, and this was done with mostly in coordination with other leading rabbis at the time, notably Reb Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, Reb Chaim Ozer Gorodensky of Vilna were among the leading Jewish leaders in the Russian Empire who were active also in efforts to lobby the Russian government. In addition, they also were very involved in lobbying Jews in Western Europe. Where Jews in Western Europe by this time were emancipated and were fairly successful. Many Jews had become very wealthy, politically powerful, and they lobbied Jewish communities in Western Europe to support the impoverished Russian Jewish community, support them financially, support them through lobbying efforts by Jews in Western Europe that had power and the like. So his father, so again, the Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak's father is very involved in these efforts as a Hasidic and Jewish leader. At 15, he's 15 years old. His father in 1895, his father brings the Rashab, Rav Shalom Ber, brings his son into his lobbying efforts as his aide, essentially his helper in lobbying efforts. And he begins to accompany his father to meetings with Jewish leaders, to meetings with Jewish officials. And then very quickly, he begins to travel himself, still as a teenager. He begins to travel himself on behalf of his father. Remember, telephones are just starting. They have telephones by now. And his father did have a phone, but most people don't have phones yet. And it's hard to communicate. And so you really have to travel from place to place. So can't be in too many places at the same time, more than one place at the same time. So his father would often send him as a young boy, essentially a teenager, to meet with Jewish leaders, with Russian officials on his behalf. We know in 1896, he accompanied his father to a major conference of leading Russian rabbis in Vilna to organize lobbying efforts on behalf of the Jewish community. So, and this continues, really, his activism, which begins in 1895, continues for almost 20 years, or more than 20 years, until the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917. And so his father is alive during this time and is the major leader, and he's essentially his father's right-hand man, and both accompanying his father to major meetings and as well as going on his own to meet with various officials and various Jewish leaders or Jewish leaders and powerful Jews in Western Europe as well. Among the things that we know that he did, some notable things that he did in 1901, together with his father, he spearheads the effort to get Western European Jewish organizations, and there were a number of aid organizations at the time that were dedicated at helping Jews that were struggling. Notably, there was the Alliance in France, which really deserves a topic of its own, the Alliance of France, because very, very influential organization that really made a big impact in the 19th century on Jewish life all around the world, including in North Africa and many other places. With the Alliance and others, he lobbies them to start building factories for Jews in the Russian Empire. While much of Europe was industrialized by the late 19th century, the Russian Empire was very, very, very backwards. And there wasn't much industrialization, but Jews were really struggling. And many Jews did not have income. They were living in they were very poor, living in little shtetlach and little villages and towns. And one of the efforts that he made in 1901 was trying to get these Western European Jewish organizations to build factories in Russia that will employ Jews, and that way they could give thousands and thousands of Jews jobs. And remember, this is before automation, so factories meant lots and lots and lots of jobs. He was successful. He got lots of money invested by Jews in Western Europe into Russia to build these factories to help provide jobs for Jews. In 1905, war broke out between Russia and Japan, which led to large parts of the Russian army being shipped off to the Far East. Now, the Far East at the time had very, very small Jewish communities. There were, but they were very, very small at the time. And the Russian Empire at the time was about 5% Jewish, and that meant that a very large number of Jews were now in the army in the Far East, and they needed Jewish supplies, particularly matzah for Passover. They had to get matzah all the way across, and just to get it to understand. I mean, they didn't have planes back then, so in 1905. So it was really getting shipments of matzah across the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is a 2-week rail journey. Thousands, I know, it's 10,000 miles. It's quite a distance from one end to the other. And so the previous Rebbe was very involved at the time. He's a young man. He's 25 years old, but he spearheaded this effort to get matzah and other Jewish supplies to the soldiers in the Far East. Towards the end, Russia lost that war with Japan, and that resulted in an uprising. And in response to that, an uprising against the Tsar that was brutally crushed. And in response to that uprising, the Tsar unleashed pogroms all across the empire in order to help channel the anger of the people away from the Tsar and towards the Jews. And terrible, horrific pogroms broke out in 1905, also a topic of its own for another time. The Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak traveled to yes, mark those down. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak traveled to Western Europe, and he led over there a lobbying effort to get Jewish banks. There were many leading Jewish banks at the time. Jews were really dominant in finance in Western Europe at the time, and to get the Jewish banks to boycott Russia, the Russian Empire, until they improved the lot of the Jews as a response to the pogroms. It was fairly successful. Many banks did boycott the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire had to put down the pogroms due to these boycotts. In 1897, going back a few years, at the age of 17, this Yosef Yitzchak gets married to his second cousin, and which was still common back then in the late 1800s for people to get married in their late teens. A couple days later, after his marriage, his father decided to build a yeshiva, a school for advanced learning, the first Chabad yeshiva, which was called Tomchei Tmimim. Last year we did a class where we spoke about the Chabad yeshiva and the evolution of Tomchei Tmimim. But when it was founded in 1897, the Rav Shalom Dober, the Rebbe at the time, put his young 17-year-old son in charge of the yeshiva as its executive director. So this young Yosef Yitzchak now leads the yeshiva as its director, and he builds it over the coming decades, builds multiple branches of the yeshiva, and it grows to really have hundreds and hundreds of students. He also needed to oversee funding for the large school, because at that time schools didn't pay tuition. There was certainly no government grants and no or loans to pay for advanced schooling. So it really required an enormous amount of fundraising. As is the Russian Jewish community was fairly poor, but he had to build a fundraising apparatus to be able to even to fund this school. And while he's running the yeshiva, which was his primary role for most of his kind of first 20 years of his life, of his adult life, but he also at the same time continued his lobbying efforts on behalf of Russian Jewry, both coordinating them with other Jewish leaders, as well as lobbying the Russian government, lobbying Jews in Western countries to use their influence and lobby their governments on behalf of Russian Jewry. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I was wondering about the last name being the same, Schneerson, as the Rebbe. So that's because the second cousin was married.
No, so Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak married his second cousin, so his wife's last name was Scheerson as well. His daughter, who was known as Rebbetzin Chayamushka, married her third cousin, who was the Rebbe. But they were cousins as well, distant, but they were cousins. Yes?
How many Rebbe's was since the beginning of the Chabad movement?
Seven.
Seven. And the last one is but we can find a successor yet.
Why did they always marry the cousin? Why is that?
It was very common back then for people to marry relatives. It was very common. They kept it in the family. I don't know. It was very, very common.
No dating apps.
Yes.
This is a problem now.
It was. You know what? There's been a belief in modern times that genetics of marrying relatives is not very safe and very healthy. I believe, I believe, and this is that's not really correct based on the way we understand genetics today, and that marrying anyone more distant than a first cousin does not really increase your chance of your children having diseases by any significant statistical amount. So anyway, you could research it, but there's a lot. There was a time 100 years ago when it was considered kind of a really bad thing to do, but I think attitudes have changed since then because science has changed. But it's a topic for another time.
In the Roman Empire, they used to get siblings.
Yes, the Torah forbids that.
They
Oh.
have siblings in the family.
All right, let's continue. In 1914, he was born in 1880, so 1914 is 34 at the time. World War I broke out. And the German armies advance fairly quickly. And as they advanced close to the town, they took time. They were pushed back, moved back and forth. But by 1916, they were advancing towards the town of Lubavitch, where Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak lived together with his father and was the center of the Chabad movement. At that point, the Rashab decided to leave Lubavitch and move to, as many Jews were doing, fleeing the front lines, and moved to the southern Russian city of Rostov. And for the next couple of years, that became his headquarters. From there, they continued to Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak continued to run the yeshiva despite the war, and it was extremely difficult, as difficult as it had been before the war. During the war, food was extremely expensive. Supplies were extremely expensive, were hard to come by. There was a lot of disease. There were great medical expenses for the students. And the students also had to leave Lubavitch as well and move to other cities, and the school had to move. And so there were great financial constraints, and people had lost most of their money due to the war. So it was a real challenge keeping the yeshiva going, but he continued to do so through the years of the war. Also during the war, and we once did a class dedicated to this topic, Jews during World War I. Also during the war, millions of Jews were forced to flee from their homes because Jews in the Russian Empire were primarily forced to live in the very western end of the Russian Empire that became known as the Pale of Settlement. And it was about a 100-mile or even less wide strip on the western end of the Russian Empire. And Jews were not really allowed to move eastward. So the most of World War I battles happened in the Pale of Settlement where Jews were living. And so the front lines were over Jewish towns and Jewish cities. And the Russian government also forced many Jews to move further east because they didn't trust them. They thought all Jews were traitors. And so as a result, millions of Jews were forced to move eastward to places where there had not been any Jewish communities prior. And so now there were millions of Jewish refugees itself, which was a big challenge. And he led efforts to help provide for many of the refugees who had found themselves in the interior of the Russian Empire. In February 1917, the Tsar was deposed in what was known as the February Revolution, and Russia was declared a republic. And all citizens, including Jews, who until then were not considered, did not have equal rights in any way, all citizens, including Jews, were granted equal rights within the new Russian Republic. And elections were to be held for a constitutional assembly that November 1917. Now, the Jewish community immediately mobilized to create Jewish parties for the elections. At that time, in places and countries where Jews had large populations, there were virtually all countries in Europe that Jews had large populations. Jews had their own Jewish parties. There were different Jewish parties. There was often the Zionist Party, a Jewish Socialist Party, and a Jewish Religious Party. So there were different Jewish parties. Often they worked together, or sometimes they even ran on a single slate together. And so the Jewish community in Russia worked to build Jewish parties to run for the elections. And the previous Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who's led these, was very involved in these efforts, coordinating with different Jewish leaders to help build Jewish slates and find people to run. I mean, this is kind of very sudden. You have no party, and then suddenly, right, because all politics is illegal because it's a dictatorship. it's a monarchy, and then suddenly in 6 months there's an election, and this election is really, really important because it's for the Constitutional Assembly. At least they thought it was. And so you have to basically build parties from scratch, find people to run in each district. Where you think Jews have a chance of winning seats, find people to run, coordinate with other Jewish groups, Zionists, secular Zionists, and secular socialists, the Bund, to try to make sure there's a single Jewish candidate that's acceptable for everyone, so that they can have better advocate overall for the Jewish community. And so he was very, very involved in this really big effort to try to develop Jewish politics and Jewish parties for the upcoming November elections. They did have free elections. Many Jewish candidates were successfully chosen and had a sizable representative in the Constitutional Assembly. However, the Assembly only met one time for one day before they were disbanded by the Bolsheviks, the communists, who had not long beforehand deposed the provisional government and had taken over. So the Constitutional Assembly didn't end up going very far. After that, that leads to a civil war within the Russian Empire, horrific civil war. Many diseases ravaged Russia during that time. Many Jews were killed during this civil war, story of its own. And then in 1920, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak's father, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber, the Rashav, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, who was 59 years old, he contracted typhus, which was one of a number of diseases going around Russia in those days during the war, and he died at the young age of 59. So his son, his only son, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, is now appointed as a Rebbe, as leader of the Chabad movement at the age of 40 in 1920. And now he has to lead the Chabad movement, but he also steps into his father's shoes, as he was already an important leader in Russia at this point, but his father had been one of the leading rabbis, one of the leaders of Jewish life in Russia, and he essentially steps into his father's role as one of the leaders of Jewish life in Russia. Now, Jewish life in the 6 years from 1914 to 1920 had totally, totally changed. Most Jews were no longer in the place that they had been 6 years earlier, because majority of Jews had been thrown out of their towns, thrown out of their shtetls, forced to leave either by the government or due to war, and were elsewhere. Had moved many into the interior of Russia, many into cities where they weren't allowed to live previously, such as St. Petersburg, which was now called Leningrad, or Moscow, or many other. They moved to many other big cities. There were essentially many of the Jewish communities essentially were non-existent or had fallen apart. Many people had died. Large numbers, hundreds of thousands of Jews had been killed, and so most people had lost their resources, their finance, their whatever assets they had. Many people had lost it. There were no jobs. So the Jewish communities were very, very disorganized. And so starting in 1920, the new Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, set about organizing Jewish communities in new places where they hadn't existed before, recreating them in places where they had existed but had fallen apart over the war, sets about organizing Jewish communities, helps them appoint rabbis, helps them appoint other religious roles, helps them rebuild their schools. He also helped Chabad communities organize around the country. The Chabad communities themselves, not only the Jewish community in general had been uprooted, but much of the Chabad community had been uprooted, and so he sent out mashpiyim, leaders to different Chabad communities to help develop Chabad communities in different places and organize them. At the same time, another thing that happened in World War I is that the entire western end of what had been the Russian Empire was all cut out of the Russian Empire in the final agreements at the end of the war and became independent countries. Part of it became Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, so they became a number of different countries. And suddenly, large numbers of Jews that had been in the Russian Empire now found themselves in other countries outside of the Soviet Union. The Soviets also made it hard to travel in and out of the Soviet Union. So there was little access and little ability for them to connect with their communities or family or that were now behind what much later would be called the Iron Curtain within the Soviet Union. And so the previous Rebbe from the Soviet Union set about organizing Chabad communities in Poland, Lithuania, in Latvia, in these other countries, and built in 1921 a Chabad yeshiva school in Warsaw, which was the largest Jewish community in Poland, largest city in Poland at the time. However, the efforts of the Rebbe to rebuild Jewish life after the war very quickly ran into trouble, ran into challenges. And that's because it became clear by 1922, 1923, that the new communist regime was not only, as they had originally said, determined to take all the money from capitalists and all their businesses and nationalize them. They also were determined to destroy religion in the Soviet Union. And although officially the Soviet Constitution allowed for religious freedoms, it didn't legally allow for full practice of religion. However, practically, the Communist Party was going about an effort to destroy religion, including by creating a Jewish section of the Communist Party, which became known as the Yevsetskia, the Jewish section, and its goal was to destroy Jewish life in the Soviet Union. So, and as a result, the Communist Party began closing Jewish communities, forcing Jewish schools closed, or taking them over and turning them into communist schools. The previous Rebbe lobbied the Soviet government to respect their constitution, which allowed for freedom of religion, freedom of education. Anyone can educate their children as they like. And he managed to get official permission for the Jewish community to function, banning local communist officials from seizing synagogues or closing mikvahs or closing down Jewish schools. So he did get official permission. However, that official permission wasn't that helpful. They discovered very quickly that the communists would say one thing and do something else. And so it became a big problem. They were going about closing down Jewish communities, destroying Jewish communities. In fact, his own yeshiva in Rostov, that had the original Chabad yeshiva that had by now moved to southern Russia, to Rostov, where he was based, was forcibly closed down in 1923. They had a big public trial, which they would do, arguing that the yeshiva was against the new communist ideology. And of course, the result of the trial was already preordained. It was already planned because they had a communist judge who was judging. The defendant on their behalf famously at the trial, in his closing arguments, told the story. Just tell, it's a great story. Told the story of how the lion meets the lion meets the lamb and tells the lamb, meets the rooster and tells the rooster, "I'm going to eat you." The rooster says, "Why? What did I do?" And the lion says, "You make too much noise." He says, "Well, if I wouldn't make noise in the morning, then I wouldn't wake up the people in the house. I need to make noise." He says, "You make too much of a mess." He says, "Yeah, but I do that because I need to lay eggs for my, that they should have people that should have eggs to eat." So he says, "Well, I'm going to eat you anyway." So why? Lion says, "Because I can." That was his closing argument for this trial. Essentially, that they don't need a reason. All their reasons are excuses. They can, and that's what they're going to do. And then in 1924, the Communist Party in Rostov, upset by the Rebbe's continued activities, forced him to leave the city, banished him from the city. And so he moved to the city that had formerly been known as St. Petersburg. At the time, it was called Leningrad. And at the time, it had the largest Jewish community in the Soviet Union. Over there, the previous Rebbe continued his efforts to keep Judaism alive in the Soviet Union. And what he did was, as schools were closed, he reopened them secretly underground. As synagogues were closed, he reopened underground synagogues. Mikvahs were closed, he built new ones. As Jewish organizations were closed, he built new ones illegally. Within a few years, he had built a network of hundreds of underground schools, hundreds of underground communities across the Soviet Union. Many of the people leading these communities, many of the teachers in these schools were caught and arrested, and he would send new ones. If someone was caught and arrested, he had many followers, he would send new people to go and teach illegally. He had to find financial resources. He was paying hundreds of salaries of all these teachers who were all working illegally. Remember, everyone in the Soviet Union worked for the Soviet Union, for the government. These people were not working for the government, but they were all illegal. They were working illegally. He had to raise money. Nobody had money because everyone's money had been taken away by the Soviet government. He had to come up with ways to raise money. And so in this way, he really built, and he came up with creative ways. It was a struggle, but he came up with creative ways to find resources. And he built this massive underground network of Jewish organizations. We've done a class where we really spoke about the underground network and how it worked, and details of how they communicated and how they and what they built. We already did a class, and if you really want to learn more about it, I recommend you listen to the podcast. Now, yes.
Did the Russians ever find the underground?
Oh, yes, they found many of them. They weren't literally underground. Underground is a term that we're using. Often they were in basements, but they weren't necessarily in basements. They may have been in attics. They may have been in private homes. They were secret.
It's not necessarily.
No, it wasn't in tunnels. They were secret, underground in the sense of secret schools. And many of them were caught. Many of them were caught because all you needed was a neighbor to tell on you, or somebody else who was caught to be tortured and share information. Remember, they were all tortured. So yes, many of them were caught. And many of them imprisoned, many of them killed. And then new ones went, and they continued them. Yes?
I mean, why couldn't he do anything? He couldn't do anything to protect these people that basically rely on the line.
How would he protect them?
I don't know, but I mean...
He was living in a totalitarian... He was living in a totalitarian regime that can... could do whatever they want. He believed that despite the danger, it was more important to keep the Jewish spark alive. He advocated, we'll talk about it soon, he advocated for sacrifice. Jews need to, in this kind of situation, need to be prepared to sacrifice as they had in earlier generations and other places where Judaism had been persecuted, people had been persecuted for being Jewish. We sacrificed for them.
Okay, so they went in knowing.
They went in knowing, yes.
Okay.
Yes. They did their best to protect themselves. Every class, and the schools usually each class was in a different place, right? Kind of lots of kids in the same place. But every class, kids would take turns being on the lookout, and they had an alibi, and they would have escape routes, and they took all the precautions they could, not to get caught, but they still got caught. Now, at the same time that the previous Rebbe is running this very, very large underground network that's growing as more and more schools and communities are closed down. And enforcement was uneven across the Soviet Union. It wasn't all Jewish communities were closed down in one go. It was slow and uneven, but in many places Jewish communities and schools were being closed down. And as that was happening, at the same time, he's also, by now, many Jewish leaders had fled the Soviet Union in the early years. And by now, he is in the mid-1920s, he is the leading Jewish rabbi, the leading Jewish figure in the country. So he's running an underground network, but he's also well known as the main, the greatest rabbi in the country. As the leading Jewish figure, he also publicly lobbied the government on behalf of the Jewish community. He also publicly lobbied officials, not secretly, and organized lobbyist efforts on behalf of the Jewish community. And he organized a group of leading rabbis to help strengthen Judaism publicly, in addition to the underground, to publicly build Judaism in the Soviet Union as much as the government allowed for legally. He was also widely respected by Jews across the Soviet Union. He was widely respected by many public figures and even communist officials who would regularly consult with him. So while he had many people, nemesis, who did not like him because of he was kind of keeping Jewish life alive, especially those that wanted to get rid of religion and Judaism in the Soviet Union. But there were many communists that maybe didn't necessarily have anything against Judaism, just believed in communism, and because officially communism was not anti-religion, and and many communists that actually did respect him and sought his advice and came to meet with him to seek his advice. So he was a very public Jewish leader, or the probably most recognized leader in the Soviet Union, while at the same time leading a massive underground network. Now, all at the same time, in the 1920s, he's still also in contact with growing Chabad communities in Eastern Europe, outside of the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia, countries that had been formerly part of the Russian Empire but were now independent. Also, as many Jews are moving to Western Europe and to the United States, he directs founding Jewish communities and Chabad communities in Western Europe, in Germany, in France, in England, and in the United States. He's in constant communication with Jews around the world from the Soviet Union. He's also, at the same time, not only involved in Jewish life in the Soviet Union and running this massive Jewish underground, he's also at the same time very involved in Jewish political issues outside of the Soviet Union, communicating with different leaders about Jewish politics in Poland and Jewish politics in other countries. And he's very involved in Jewish life around the world, outside in Israel, in Palestine, which was then under the British mandate, very involved in Jewish life in other places, not even Chabad, just general Jewish life, outside of the Soviet Union, communicating with him. Communicating with people outside of the Soviet Union with regular letters and lots of communication, also to help get them to lobby on behalf of Jews of the Soviet Union and get them to support Jews of the Soviet Union, but also getting involved in Jewish issues outside. The most dramatic event of the Rebbe's life, which we did a class about last year dedicated to it, was his arrest and liberation in 1927. In 1925, just a very quick overview of what happened. In 1925, the Jewish section of the Communist Party made efforts to unify all Jewish communities into essentially a national Jewish community, create this large national Jewish community within the Soviet Union. The goal was for the government to be able to seize control of the Jewish community. If you create a nationalized Jewish community rather than each Jewish community being independent, then the government, national government, has control over all the Jewish communities. The previous Rebbe was staunchly opposed to those efforts, very publicly. It was not something that he was secretly trying to counter, but very publicly opposed. And it was that opposition, along with the communist knowledge of his large underground network, that really led to his arrest in 1927. And so he's arrested in the summer of 1927. He was brought to Spalanka, which was a prison in Leningrad for high-level detainees. And his arrest led to a huge backlash, both within the Soviet Union. Remember, he is the most recognized Jewish leader in the Soviet Union, Jewish religious figure. He's respected by Jews around the country, including many communist officials and many government officials. And so there was a huge, huge backlash, even from within the Communist Party, over his arrest. It also led to a huge backlash all around the world. The Soviet Union was struggling for recognition by countries around the world. Most countries did not yet recognize the Soviet government. It was on the front page. The previous Rebbe was a very, very famous figure. It was on the front page of all newspapers, including here in the United States. It was a major, major story that was followed intently especially by Jewish newspapers, but really general papers as well, were following the story intently. And and thanks to lobbying efforts, the Rebbe was freed after 2.5 weeks in prison, but he was forced to go to exile to a place a couple hours drive from Moscow called Kostroma. He was there for 9 days before he was freed entirely, on condition that he didn't return to Leningrad. The Communist Party in Leningrad said, we are not letting him back here. They did not want him to come back there. They didn't want him to be their problem. Instead, he went to Moscow. Any questions? Meanwhile, though, the noose of the Soviet Union was tightening. There were many Soviet officials that were very upset that the previous Rebbe had been released because they wanted to stop his efforts to keep Jewish life alive in the Soviet Union, and knew about all of his secret activities. And so it became clear that, and many were advocating for the Rebbe to be rearrested. So it became clear to the Rebbe and his followers that the Rebbe needed to leave the country before he was arrested again. But there's an iron curtain. How do you get out of the Soviet Union? Especially such a prominent figure, the Soviets were not going to be quick to let him go. So one of the Rebbe's followers was Rabbi Mordechai Dubin. Rabbi Mordechai Dubin, maybe also worthy of a class of his own, Rabbi Mordechai Dubin. He was the leader of the Jewish community in Latvia. He was the official president of the Jewish community. He was also a member of parliament in Latvia, very powerful figure. At the time, Latvia was one of the few countries in the world that recognized the Soviet Union. So, although it was a tiny country, but it was very, very important to the Soviets because it was one of the few countries that actually recognized it. So Rabbi Dubin lobbied the Soviet Union. He had connections in the Soviet Union to allow the Rebbe to move to Latvia. And he even conditioned there was a trade agreement that they were going to have between the Soviet Union and Latvia, which was a huge deal because most countries refused to trade with the Soviet Union at the time. And so he conditioned his vote in Parliament, in Latvian Parliament, for the trade agreement on the Rebbe's release. So thanks to his lobbying efforts, the Rebbe was allowed to leave the Soviet Union together with his family. His personal secretaries were allowed to come along, and he was even allowed to take his library with him. So in October of 1927, the Rebbe moved to Latvia and was now outside of the Soviet Union for the rest of his life. Once in Latvia, the Rebbe remained in contact, though, with Jews in the Soviet Union, supporting them financially and coordinating the underground Jewish communities and schools that he had built, continued to coordinate them from outside the Soviet Union, as well as help build the more public legal Jewish organizations. He also, while in Latvia, not only continued to support Jews in the Soviet Union, and he was in a better position definitely to fundraise for Jews in the Soviet Union once he was outside, he also began to focus more on Jews outside of the Soviet Union, Jews in Latvia and Jews in Eastern Europe. So he traveled now that he's outside the Soviet Union, he traveled across Europe to visit his followers and to fundraise and organize for Soviet Jewry. He also at this point became a big advocate for women's Jewish education, which was fairly new then in the 1920s. Jewish women had been taught historically to read, but not much more than that. And there was a big movement in the 1920s to teach Jewish women about Judaism, to build Jewish schools for Jewish women. And the Rebbe became a big supporter of that movement and even started an organization for Jewish women to learn together. He also then expanded his yeshiva network, building another yeshiva in Vilna and another one in Lodz in southern Poland. In the summer of 1929, about 2.5 years after he had left the Soviet Union, he went on a trip. The trips, there were no planes, right? So they were a big deal. First, he traveled to Israel, to the land which Palestine at the time, which was the British Mandate of Palestine. And then after traveling and visiting Israel briefly, he then went to the United States with two goals in mind. Firstly, the United States had by now a massive Jewish community, numbering in the millions, most of them from the former Russian Empire, from Eastern Europe. And his goal was firstly to fundraise for Soviet Jewry and to raise money to support his organizations in the Soviet Union, as well as to help build Jewish life across America. At the time, American Jewish life was fairly weak. Jews were assimilating in very, very large numbers. And there were Jewish schools, but very, very, very few. There wasn't much kind of by way of organized Jewish community life here in the United States. And so part of his effort was going to be to build that. So during his visit here in the United States, he was based in New York. He was here for almost a year. He traveled to many different Jewish communities across the Eastern Seaboard, as well as he went to the Midwest. He went as far as St. Louis, Missouri. He also traveled to Washington, D.C., where he met with President Hoover to advocate for Russian Jewry. And during his almost year-long visit, he also reignited Jewish Chabad communities across the United States, building seeds for the community that he would later establish on his next trip to the United States. So he goes back in late 1930. He goes back to Latvia, where he remains for another couple years, though traveling around Europe a lot. In 1934, though, he left Latvia and he moved to Poland. Poland was where there were now a number of Chabad yeshivas outside of the Soviet Union, but Poland, Warsaw, was where the major yeshiva was, and so he moves to Warsaw to be near the main school. He later the Rebbe and the school moved to a suburb of Warsaw called Otwock. And there he was close near the yeshiva, and he led the sizable Chabad community in Poland. But he continued to communicate with Jewish communities across Europe, the United States, Israel. But his primary focus even then remained on Jews in the Soviet Union. He raised large funds to help fund Jewish organizations in the Soviet Union. In fact, he was noted by other organizations as being the only person who could really get money into the Soviet Union and get money around the Soviet Union. He had network and ways of transferring money both into the Soviet Union, large amounts of money, as well as get it to your destination within the Soviet Union. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union was becoming more and more and more totalitarian. It was a very gradual process until it came a point where you basically couldn't say anything, and virtually everyone was getting arrested. So through that, he was able to keep his network alive, even though many of his followers and many of the people leading the network were arrested, many of them killed, many of them sent to the gulags. But he continued his focus on the Soviet Union. He also worked on helping a lot of Jews that were in the Soviet Union and had got into trouble for the activities they had done, were maybe wanted in the Soviet Union, and he helped them get out of the Soviet Union. There were two parts to getting out of the Soviet Union. One was to actually get an exit visa from the Soviet Union, which itself was a challenge. But then the other thing was Jews needed to find a place to go. By the 1930s, there were very few places that would take Jews. And so he worked on getting visas for individuals to the United States, to Palestine, which was hard to get. The British didn't allow Jews in at the time, to Poland, to other places, trying to get Jews out of the Soviet Union. In 1939, World War II broke out. At the time, he's in Otwock, which was a suburb of Warsaw. He soon after the war broke out, he fled with his family to Warsaw, which he felt was safer at the time. He endured over there a couple weeks of the German bombing of Warsaw, survived it. Many didn't. But once the Germans came into Warsaw as one of the most prominent Jewish figures of his time, he felt his life was in danger. The Germans were going after Jewish leaders, and so he went into hiding. Meanwhile, the Chabad community in the United States, which was fairly established by this point, lobbied the U.S. government, which had not yet entered the war at this point. They don't enter the war till 2 years later, in 1941, or more than 2 years later. So they had not yet entered the war. We still had relations with Germany, decent relations with Germany. So the Chabad community lobbied the U.S. government to help save the Rebbe. They got a lot of high-level officials involved, Jews in the Roosevelt government, and they put enormous diplomatic pressure on the German officials, and that led to the Germans to agree to extract the Rebbe from Poland. And so they took him out of Poland together with his entire family and brought him to Latvia, where the previous Rebbe was a citizen of. He had gotten, after he had left the Soviet Union, he had gotten Latvian citizenship. So he's now back in Latvia. Poland itself was under German control, Nazi control. He actually encouraged many of his followers, especially the students of the yeshiva, to try to flee towards Lithuania. And then from Lithuania, he encouraged them to get what became known as the Sugihara passports to go towards to go to Japan. And countless of his students and followers did take those Sugihara passports and made it to Japan, eventually making it, and that way surviving the war. The Rebbe himself, the Chabad community here in the United States continued to lobby the U.S. government to allow for the Rebbe and his family visas to enter the United States. At the time, getting a visa for any Jew was extremely, extremely difficult. They turned back most Jews, but the U.S., he was a very, very prominent leader, and the United States agreed to take Jewish leaders, and the previous Rebbe was granted a visa and was allowed to come to the United States, and he arrived here in March of 1940, where he arrived in New York, and he settled in New York. Now, when the Rebbe arrived to the United States in 1940, he was definitely the most famous rabbi of his time to come to the United States, and thousands gathered to greet him. There's video of it, of the crowds at the port when he comes, and there's video of him disbarking. It's all silent video, right? The 1940 video of him disbarking from the boat. It was a very big deal. The day he arrived. Now, when the previous Rebbe arrived, he was at the time, he was no longer a young man in 1940. He was already 60 years old. He also had been tortured by the Soviets. So he had gone under he was physically broken. He wasn't well. He wasn't no longer able to walk. He was in a wheelchair. But he announced in his first public address to his followers and admirers that he didn't come to the United States to retire, but he came to build Jewish life in America. Now, at that time, there were millions of Jews living in the United States. There were probably about 5 million Jews in the United States at that time, but there was not much for Jewish education. There were literally a handful of schools, maybe 4 or 5 in the Jewish schools in the entire country at the time. And many Jews by this point were second generation, their parents having arrived between 1890 and 1914. So most Jews were second, third generation, and many of them assimilating, just dropping being Jewish entirely, not even raising their children as Jewish, not even letting them know that they're Jewish. So the previous Rebbe announced as soon as he came that the first thing he wants to do is establish a school, build a school. In fact, the next day he called some of his followers in, and he said, yesterday I announced that I want to start a school, and nobody built anything. How come? So they immediately did. They immediately started a school. Within days, he started a school. My grandfather, who was living in New York at the time, was one of the first students in that school when it was started in 1940. Now, he started, first it was a yeshiva school for advanced students, and later he's going to start an elementary school and a high school. What he did was he had a number of students study that first year in 1940, and then slowly the school began to grow. And then after a year, he called in the original students one by one, and he sent them to other places to go build new schools. My grandfather in 1941 was sent by the Rebbe to go build a school in Newark, New Jersey, which he did. He was 19 years old at the time. And so, and he did, and that way the Rebbe established many schools across the country. At that time, there were only Jewish schools in New York, not anywhere outside of New York, which was by far the largest Jewish community in the country. But the Rebbe built schools, many schools, all across the country. At the same time, as he's building Jewish life in the United States, the Rebbe also built educational network, and not just schools. He built programs for kids and Shabbat programs for kids, and he built a program to take kids out of public school for a religious hour, and many programs to try to connect Jews back to Judaism. At the same time, while the war is raging in Europe, he is also at the same time working to save people, both trying to fundraising to send people with Sugihara visas across the Soviet Union to Japan, which was expensive to do, try lobbying the U.S. government for visas for prominent Jews, which many such visas were granted, unfortunately nowhere near enough. And all at the same time, as he's building Jewish life, he's also lobbying for Jews in Europe, trying to save them from the Holocaust. They probably didn't, at least at first, know the extent of what it would be. He was devastated when they did discover, like most Jews, was devastated when they did discover what had happened. And then in 1945, once the war was over, there were now hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees that had that found themselves now in Western Europe and with nowhere to go, including he encouraged thousands of his own followers to use this escape route that they had created from the Soviet Union. We did a class last year, or maybe 2 years ago, where we spoke about this major escape where over 1,000 people escaped from the Soviet Union. And so they also ended up in DP camps. And slowly the Rebbe worked to try to get visas for these people to different countries. Many went to Palestine. Eventually they'll be able to go to Israel once it become independent. Many used particularly his people working for him were particularly effective with France, bringing many into France, and many to England, to the United States, and to other countries. Even he sent to Australia. He managed to get some people in. So so the Rebbe continued trying to help the refugees and build Jewish life in the United States all the way until his death at the age of 69 in 1950. When he died, he passed the leadership of Chabad passed on to his son-in-law, became known as the Rebbe. We've done multiple classes about the Rebbe and his influence, and really built Jewish life around the world and built Chabad to what it is today. So just to summarize, the Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the previous Rebbe, was the leader of Chabad, but he was also a major Jewish leader during challenging times for Jews. He built the Chabad yeshiva system that educated tens of thousands of students, that today educates tens of thousands of students, but he built it from scratch. He expanded Chabad reach beyond where it had started in the Russian Empire to become a global movement, but he's probably always going to be remembered and best known for his efforts to preserve Judaism in the Soviet Union. He was really one of the key, he was also one of the key figures in building Jewish life here in the United States in the 20th century. Jewish life in the Soviet Union went through a lot of challenges, but it survived. It remained underground for 70 years until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, when it came public, and Jewish life thrives today in Russia, Ukraine, unfortunately they're at war, and other former Soviet Union countries, all thanks to his efforts. Back then, many Russian Jews did leave Russia, whether in the 40s, many left later in the 70s. That led to the building of many Russian Jewish communities in Israel, in the United States, in other countries, many of which their connection with Judaism is thanks to the previous Rebbe's efforts. And today, thankfully, we have surviving Chabad life here in the United States, thriving Jewish life here in the United States, also very much thanks to his efforts. But perhaps most notable, I want to conclude with this, was the previous Rebbe, when he worked on something, when something needed to be done, nothing was able to stop him. Even though he faced very, very great challenges, nothing was able to stop him. If something needed to be done, it would be done no matter what. And he used a term, it was an old Jewish term, but he really popularized the term Mesirus Nefesh in Yiddish, or Mesirat Nefesh. Mesirat Nefesh, sacrifice. Jewish sacrifice. That one has to be prepared to sacrifice anything and everything. And he lived by that, both in his early days as a leader under the Russian Empire, but particularly under the Soviet Union, where he encouraged his followers to do things that they knew carried a death sentence, that they knew can lead them to life in Gulag. He encouraged them, don't worry, just sacrifice. Do what you need to do what needs to get done, regardless. It was that value of sacrifice that allowed him to succeed in challenge after challenge. And he lived in some very, very trying times and achieved some amazing things against a lot of odds. And he really worked against all the odds because nothing stopped him. If he was determined to do something, he made it happen. Whether, no matter who was going to try to stop him, he would make things happen. And he encouraged all his followers and all his admirers to continue to make things happen. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. Be prepared to sacrifice for everything. And that's really what he stood for. Mesirut Nefesh, sacrifice, And it's something that he also here in the United States encouraged Jews, said they couldn't do it. They couldn't. They couldn't build Jewish schools. They couldn't build Jewish organizations. They couldn't do it. You do it anyway. You make it happen. Just to conclude, I mentioned earlier that my grandfather, at the age of 19, was sent by the Rebbe to open a school in Newark. He was called in Thursday night. The Rebbe called him into his office, and he was given. The Rebbe told him, "You'll go to my secretary. He'll give you money for your train to Newark. Here's an address of a Chabad person in Newark that you can stay by. Go find their house." And it was Thursday night. Go tomorrow morning. Monday morning, I want a school open in Newark. That's the way he worked. And he did it. He did do it. He did it. He went to Newark. He got the money for the train. He went to Newark with not a penny in his pocket. Went to Newark, found the address, put his things down, stayed there for Shabbat, over Shabbat, went from synagogue to synagogue in Newark. It was a very, very Jewish city at the time, announcing that he's starting a school. He didn't know yet where, announcing that he's starting the school Monday morning. And he got 7 students, first day of school. Yes. So that was the previous Rebbe's way of doing things. That's how he worked in the Soviet Union. That's how he worked in the United States. That was his secret of success. And really, I think we all can learn from him that something needs to get done, you do it. Misirut nefesh, be prepared to sacrifice. Doesn't matter the cost. You make sure it happens. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Ellie, and Alex is not here for sponsoring our breakfast. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Next week we are going to talk about putting dishes in the mikveh. So the rules of putting dishes in the mikveh, you may have heard of it before, you may not have. We'll talk about the rules of when you buy new dishes to put in the mikveh. And anyone who would like to sponsor a future week, please let me know. We definitely can use sponsors going forward. Thank you all.